SME. Okay.
Kính mời các anh chị đại biểu online cũng như offline thì có câu hỏi nào thì cứ.
So online and offline participants, if you have any questions, please raise your voice. There is one question from Miss Loan. So yeah, maybe yeah, she is on site. So Miss Loan can share.
Translated version of this question. So maybe I take the next one.
Just a moment.
Oh, okay.
We have a question.
Can you share with us? I have one question.
Xin nhờ thính giả chia sẻ giúp tôi một cái nội dung, tức là ở cái giai đoạn ban đầu của ở Malai á, thì khi mà dùng Ifrs, đặc biệt là việc áp dụng Ifrs số 13 ạ, thì chị có thể chia sẻ xem là ở Malai gặp có những cái thách thức hoặc những cái khó khăn gì và những cái cách thức giải quyết để vượt qua những cái khó khăn thách thức đó khi mà triển khai Ifrs, đặc biệt là trong đó có cái Ifrs số 13 trong cái điều kiện thị trường có thể ban đầu chưa phát triển chẳng hạn, hoặc như thế nào đó để chúng ta có thể là có thể vận hành được cái Ifrs sau này là nó thuận lợi. Rồi, xin cảm ơn ạ.
Yeah, so I think similar to what we are doing now, Malaysia, our MASB also make reference and communicate with bodies like IASB to understand how to apply certain parts of the standard. And similarly, like here, I'm sharing the experiences where we've already transited into IFRS. We learn as well from the other practitioners how they overcome that hurdle when it comes to complying with IFRS. So like, for example, today, I share with you how we actually also look into discounted cash flow as a basis to do the model. But of course, at the end of the day, the standard do require us to prioritize on observable type of data. So when we say observable data, example, if you have a market research report that talks about certain industry outlook, that is one basis that you can consider in developing inside the model, right? But also at the same time, I'm also saying that sometimes the cost to acquire data is not cheap, because these market research reports are done by expert researchers. They do surveys and collect various amount of data, and they pay for such data. Right, so where we see in Malaysia, or we expect that some of the companies may struggle, is they want to keep it cheap. They want to keep it simple. They don't want to spend money on it. So does that mean that I can say that undue cost of effort is overcome? Like I said, it's very difficult, right? Because the data is so important, the disclosure is so important, that it is worth more to present it than to not do it. Right? So there's always a need to identify proxy of data. So example, like even for non-listed company shares, right, unquoted shares, ISB training material is one clear example where they say you can use a discounted cash flow model to actually determine the fair value of these investments, right? So it's a matter of whether are we able to identify the related data that is used to support in the valuation model? Okay, so other things like experts, right? The question is, do we have experts within the industry, or in certain type of industry are so specialized that the valuation expert is not any simple valuer that can do it? Right, so this is where, to a certain extent, if you cannot find it within this region, do you then look at outside, right? So, so these are some of the methods that we have used. If we can't, if there are certain good, let's say, example, disclosures or methodology that has been used by countries that are already IFRS compliant, we generally make reference to them to see what is the basis they have used, so that we can replicate it here as well when we do the implementation. But To a certain extent, also you need to look at the extent of reliability of the data that is available here, right? So just now, he asked the question, what happens if this information is tampered with and whatnot? Then in applying the accounting standards, we apply judgment, right? If we know for a fact that this is not reflective of fair value, then don't use it, because you are giving the reader unreliable information. But if you change your methodology in addressing certain valuation computation, then do the sufficient disclosure to tell the reader what have you used and why you say is reliable. So what will be the supporting information that you are providing, right? So if I dissect a bit in terms of discounted cash flow, because we foresee that a lot of companies will use a discounted cash flow. Now, projection of cash flow like growth rate and all is trend analysis from equivalent companies or industry. That from statistics data, you should be able to get, right? So even if you don't have here, so for example, in practice, if I don't have Malaysia data, at minimum, then I go at Southeast Asia. Then if Southeast Asia, if the data is specific to certain area, let's say Singapore, or maybe it's more relevant in Indonesia, then I need to identify the gap and do the necessary adjustment. So there's always a starting point that you can use as a basis, but so unfortunately, the standard don't tell you to what extent do you adjust. So that's where a bit of judgment comes into play. Why do we say that a risk premium should be adjusted for at 0.5%, for example, right? So, and most of the time it's more like a comparative available information, a pool to get a range, right? So you don't need to get spot on correct. If you are within the acceptable range within the industry, that should be quite acceptable, but you supplement your disclosure with the sensitivity analysis, right? To tell what will be the impact to the fair value if these inputs vary by 5% or 10%. Okay, this is where the accounting standard acknowledges that there will be some sensitivity and it requires that disclosure, because IFRS 13 acknowledge valuation technique is an estimation, right? So there will be subject for uncertainty. So that uncertainty, they just want you to disclose, okay? So certain things like discount rate. So most of the time you expect to see like weighted average cost of capital, okay? Now WACC rate can be obtained online for listed company, right? Then you want to break down the WACC formula, there is a formula to it. So when you want to do, whether you want to get the cost of equity or you want to get the cost of debt or you want to get the WACC, there is formula to derive it. So then it comes back to what would be your valuation objective. What am I valuing? And then if this WACC rate for individual standalone company, you don't have it, you can create using the formula, but your inputs, you identify similar size company, similar industry as a starting point. So there's always a starting point from listed company, right? So if I'm a standalone agriculture company, then I can look for listed agriculture company. Of course, if I'm looking at a coffee plantation, I don't go and take a rubber plantation, right? So these are just the bare minimum that you need to assess whether it makes sense or not, right? So if I were to do a coffee plantation company, I find an equivalent listed company of, let's say, coffee plantation, and I build from there the adjustment on how much I need to adjust in terms of risk and whatnot, okay? So at the end of the day, IFRS 13 is, there's no bright line in terms of how much to adjust and what, because the standard expect us to apply that judgment. Yeah. And they ask us to disclose those judgment that has been made. So in short, how we actually implement in Malaysia is also from best practices, like how we observe in UK. That is one example, right? Yeah. Okay, so let me take another question. Okay, so this question asked is according to IAS 16, when you apply the valuation policy, you apply by class, right? That's correct. But your class of asset are different in nature. So fair value here, very specific. It says you must take into account the characteristic of the asset. So I have, if you think that a different valuation model is appropriate for different type of characteristic of asset, then you can do so, right? But you just need to be clear on your basis of measurement. Okay, so it really, okay, so the question here is there a circumstance in which we cannot make a reliable estimation of fair value, such as assumption and input data are so uncertain? What should we do in such circumstance? So honestly, if it's really, really unreliable, okay. Now the standards do mention, when we talk about unreliable, having multiple fair value doesn't mean that it's unreliable. They gave that example. So for example, right, I transact with company A, X amount, that is one fair value. I transact same thing with company B, willing buyer, willing seller, I can sell at a different price. That's another fair value. I can transact with company C, same thing, but the person don't know how to bargain, right? I charge higher. It's another fair value. So I have three different fair value. It's unreliable. The standard says no, that doesn't mean unreliable. So this is where I come back to highlight that, to say that fair value really unreliable, it must be really that the data, you cannot support it at all. Then you end up at cost. That is where the very, very rare circumstance. Okay, so having multiple values of fair value doesn't mean that it's unreliable. The standard do mention that. So that also means that because I have different outcome of a particular value doesn't mean I don't have to do. You just need to make sure you have done the proper hierarchy in identifying what is the unit of account, what is the market participant's perspective. So what is your principal market? If don't have, most advantageous market, and then you value it. Then supplement with disclosure, how you got the figure. Okay? So to answer this question, right, if it's really, really unreliable, and when I say unreliable is unsupportable, you end up in cost, which is the standard don't expect this to happen a lot. Okay, so for application of 13 in a bank, 13, so long as you apply IFRS standard, the standard is written to be industry agnostic. So everyone who adopts IFRS will apply it accordingly. Okay? This one I think I answered earlier. About measuring liability, we consider the entity's own credit risk. Okay, so when we say own credit risk means the ability or the potential default of yourself to settle the liability. That's what it means. So this actually would generally affect the risk premium, right? The risk premium that we are putting in to value that liability. So that will affect your fair value. Is there any case transaction cost? including in fair value of an asset? The standard says no, you don't include that in, right? So it's unlikely I will find a situation where we intentionally include transaction costs in the fair value. So transaction cost is you follow the other standard on whether or not you should put it as a capitalized in your initial recognition, okay? Okay, another question is how long is a valuation applicable? For the valuation report dated June 2022, could we apply this valuation report for the financial statement as of December? So I would say you need to look at the circumstance underlying the valuation. Okay. Now, certain type of asset or liability do not have very high volatility in terms of its fair value fluctuation. Then if you can substantiate that, you might then say the value has not moved as of December. But things that you know have very high volatility, the fair value will fluctuate in a very short period of time and historically has fluctuated, then more likely you cannot use it. So again, standard don't tell you do valuation how often. They only tell you initial measurement when, subsequent measurement how frequent, according to the respective standard, and then you do the valuation accordingly. Or you can justify if the valuation report can be reliable, then you can use that. But you need to document why you think that there is no change in the fair value from the last valuation report. So in terms of the management methods for calculation of the valuation report, so if they use a particular method in 2022, can I apply again the same in 2023? So I pose this question to you. Last year, I had COVID, and I measure with COVID consideration. Next year, no COVID anymore. Can I use the same thing? Inputs will have to change, but the valuation technique may be the same. Okay? Another question is in Vietnamese. G and FP. Oh, answer already? Okay.
This question already answered.
Okay. Okay, so this one is where the question is that when an auditor asks, what is your basis or rationale for the risk premium adjustment? So you're asking what is the auditor's basis. Firstly, the auditor want to hear from you. What is your basis? And they will also challenge whether the basis that you use sounds reasonable or not. Okay. Secondly is the auditor normally have their own internal expert as a reference point for them to also ask for a second opinion. They also have that. So like for us in most of the audit firm, we do have internal valuation specialists that we will get them to give us their assessment of our auditees method. And they will tell us whether it makes sense or not. So even if I as an auditor, I may not be a valuation expert, but I have a pool of experts that support me in audit. So sometimes when the auditor asks you, firstly is we also want to understand what is your basis for making such a premium adjustment? What was your underlying reference point? Yeah, so actually how auditor approach it is in such a way. They want to hear from you first.
We have a question in Vietnamese, so the interpreter will share with you. You can use. Oh. Yes.
Okay, so in Malaysia, our tax and accounting have difference. Okay, it's very common. Okay, now in Singapore, different, right? Singapore, their basis is they follow accounts. Malaysia, we have our own tax rule. So a simple one would be, if you collect the money upfront, but the revenue is not earned yet, means upfront collection, they tax you already. Whichever comes first, okay? Or if the money haven't collected, but the revenue earned, I also tax you when you recognize revenue. Most taxation is like that. This is one example. So on the question on tax, anywhere that the accounts and the tax rule is different, we have IAS 12, deferred tax. So for Malaysia, when we adopted IFRS 16 and IFRS 15, we had a lot of deferred tax issue. Yeah. So wherever the tax rule and the accounting rule don't match, then the standard asks you to make the necessary provision in the deferred tax liability or asset, provided you pass the recognition test for the deferred tax asset. Yeah. So the answer is no, they don't talk to each other. Ideally, it's better if they do, but this is another issue because the government needs to plan the budgets and cash flow. So the rules are there for that purpose. Okay, profit or loss in day one, is it the same as premium or discount, right? I believe when you talk about premium and discount in IFRS 9 perspective, that is what you agree with your counterparty on what premium you will require to pay or any discount on it. So it's different in terms of your day one gain or loss, because this day one gain or loss is intended to capture when there is a difference in fair value. So if you willing buyer, willing seller contractually in the fair value of this instrument have embedded premium or discount, you may not flush that out. Yeah. Okay, so here the question is, do we need valuation specialists in our council in order to perform IFRS conversion in Vietnam? Are there valuation specialists in Malaysian Financial Statement Council or Committee? For example, should it be efficient to hire valuation service or employees specialized in valuation? Okay, so in Malaysia, whenever we were to issue any interpretive guidance or whenever we want to issue a standard, if the issue in hand requires specialists, they will invite them as part of working group to discuss potential issues in adopting a particular standard. So, so for example, when you talk about biological asset, right? You even have experts in agriculture that comes in to explain. Why? Because I am not a farmer. I am not familiar, right? I'm not familiar with the life cycle of that particular asset, but I need to understand it for the purpose of valuation. So in this kind of working group, you will have industry players, you will have auditors, you will have accountants, and you will have specialists. So earlier I mentioned about Malaysia having issued guidance to apply the IFRS 15. They involve lawyer because these are driven by our Malaysian jurisdiction on property developers standard residential contract. Right? So we have a body in Malaysia that protects me as a buyer, homeowner, so that property developers don't undermine the consumers, right? So they have a body to protect us. So with those body, they have discussion when it comes to development of standards. Yeah. So yes, you should involve where required specialists in standard development. Okay, that's all. No other question?
Mời các anh chị tiếp tục có câu hỏi đấy ạ.
Maybe to share one more point, right? So I think some question asked is valuation fee. We know is sometimes can be quite extensive. So depending on the nature of the asset and the expectation in terms of the fluctuation of fair value, if there's a reason to believe that it doesn't fluctuate so much, sometimes they don't incur a full valuation fees. They do what we call a desktop valuation. So what the valuer do is, they will engage the same valuer, and the valuer will refer back to his full valuation report and see whether there's any need to update any of their inputs. Then they will reissue you a desktop report. Yeah, so for those, typically, I don't see companies do a valuation annually, because to do a full valuation is sometimes can be quite expensive, especially if you have a lot of property. If it's just one, maybe it's okay. So sometimes the auditors would accept desktop valuation, but if you do 10 years desktop valuation, then there will be a point where people will challenge, right? So like Malaysia, if the property appreciation in terms of prices, if it's very significant from one year to another, then as an auditor, I will ask you, why do you think that I don't need a full valuation? Because the fluctuation is very high. Yeah, so it still comes back to the nature of assets or liability that you have, whether or not you should get a valuation report again.
Cũng xin chuyên gia chia sẻ cái kinh nghiệm của Malaysia nói chung và ở các cái quốc gia khác nói riêng ở trong cái vấn đề này. Tức là về cái thứ tự ưu tiên thì chúng ta có cái level 1 ấy, là dựa trên cái giá niêm yết, đúng không? Thế nhưng mà thực ra thì cái giá niêm yết nó có thể bị ảnh hưởng rất nhiều bởi các cái yếu tố như là những cái giao dịch thôn tính, hoặc là trong một cái điều kiện nào đó mà giá nó có cái sự thay đổi đột biến, thì có rất nhiều khả năng là cái giá niêm yết tại một cái thời điểm hoặc trong một cái giai đoạn nhất định nó chưa chắc đã phải thật sự là fair value. Vậy thì trong trường hợp này thì chúng ta có những cái hạn chế gì để mà không lấy giá niêm yết hay không? Và cái căn cứ hoặc là cái cơ sở để mà lấy một cái giá khác giá niêm yết thì như thế nào, thì có thể chia sẻ thêm cái thực tế đó ạ?
So I think this is add-on on the earlier question, right? So if I have quoted price, but if I have reason to believe that they are not reflective of a fair value, then in an accounting and financial reporting perspective, I would say don't use an unreliable source, right? But you need to firstly know whether is it reliable or not. Then if you are using an alternative method, say for example, there is a quoted price, but I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use a valuation model. I have to firstly say why. right? So you might have to explain why in your financial statement that you did not categorize this as a hierarchy 1 when you could have. Then when you use hierarchy 2 or 3, then you need to explain what are the adjustments or what is the basis for you to do the valuation. Yeah, so the standard don't tell you when you cannot rely, because the standard is written assuming everything is done proper. So they say if you have quoted price, we assume that is reliable, you should take that. So this is where the professional judgment comes into play, both by the preparer of the financial statement and the auditor. Right? Sometimes, yeah. So it depends on the situation. If the company uses the level 1, but the auditor think it's not reliable, they will also ask you, why are you using this one? So it could also be the flip side. The auditor may ask you, why are you not using level 1 when you have? So in any case, the auditor's role is to challenge when they think it doesn't seem consistent or reasonable. Yeah. But as a financial statement preparer, this is my account. I know it better than you. So when it comes to judgments and assumption, you know best. And when it comes to judgment, different people have different tolerance of risk and different basis of judgment. So when the auditor challenge a judgment, most of the time is to listen in on your basis so they can gauge, are you too conservative or are you too aggressive? Yeah. And they will retest it for themselves, whether will it still be within the range or it's so sensitive and material that it affects their opinion. Yeah, that's where a lot of discussion with the auditor will happen if they think that the judgment is not reasonable or supportable.
Tôi có một câu hỏi nữa để mong bà được bà chia sẻ, đó là về mặt định giá đất đai. Thế thì đất đai thì nó có thể sử dụng cho nhiều mục đích. Ví dụ như là mục đích có thể là xây dựng du lịch, ví dụ như là sân golf rồi khách sạn, nhưng mà mục đích cũng có thể là để là sử dụng làm trang trại các thứ. Thế và đương nhiên là tùy theo mục đích thì nó sẽ có cái định giá khác nhau của cái tức là theo cái mục đích của cái người sử dụng á. Thế nhưng mà có thể là tại cái thời điểm mà tôi được đầu tư vào cái mảnh đất đó thì mục đích của tôi là để xây dựng sân golf, nhưng mà vì lý do là chính phủ lúc một thời gian sau đó chính phủ là lại thay đổi quy hoạch ở cái khu đó, nên là cái mục đích ban đầu của tôi là không thực hiện được, mà tôi phải chuyển sang mục đích ví dụ như là để làm trang trại hay là để một mục đích khác. Vậy thì trong trường hợp này thì tôi có phải đánh giá lại cái fair value của cái đất đai hay không? Đấy, tức là bởi vì là cái quy hoạch đất nó có thể có sự thay đổi, hoặc là lúc đầu thì tôi đầu tư vào đất đó với mục đích là phải làm nông trại, bởi vì đất đó không được cho phép làm thương mại dịch vụ, nhưng sau đó thì người ta lại cởi trói, người ta lại cho phép sử dụng đất đó làm thương mại dịch vụ chẳng hạn. Đấy thì trong các cái tình huống đó thì fair value có phải đánh giá lại hay không? Mà đặc biệt là trong cái đất đai trong những cái khu vực đó thì ví dụ như là nó lại không có cái tham chiếu của thị trường, tức là thậm chí là có thể là các cái yếu tố input của level 2 nó cũng không xác định được. Đấy thì chúng ta nên xác định fair value như thế nào?
So for land, so we do have the highest and best use concept in Ifrs 30. So the expectation is that when there are certain trigger events that are significant, say for example, a law on that particular piece of land, that will also trigger a need for impairment assessment in the context of IS 36. Okay. Now for fair value also similarly, now because we have the highest and best use concept, The expectation is that if there's supportable information to believe that the market would expect you to change the way you can maximize the profit from this piece of land, you value it in accordance with that. So for example, if earlier the plan was a golf course and now it says, no, not for tourism anymore, it's for agriculture. Then although initial plan was for tourism, I still value it based on the highest and best use, which could be agriculture. Yeah. So this is where just now when I shared the UK FRC example, that was one case of a scenario where the asset is not used based on the valuation assumption, but the valuation assumption in accordance with IFRS 13 will have to follow highest and best use, which could be different purpose. Yeah, so whenever there is a significant trigger or event, as an accountant, it will warrant us to check, should there be a change in value, which could be fair value up, or is it an impairment? Yeah. Then any impact, the qualitative narrative that you put in your disclosure, you put that in. Like, why is there a significant drop or increase in fair value? It's because of that.
Vâng. Thế đối với đất đai thì rõ ràng ở đây nó không phải là một cái thứ mà niêm yết. Thì xin bà cũng cho biết cái kinh nghiệm của Malaysia là chúng ta sẽ xác định fair value theo cơ sở ví dụ như của DCF hay là của một cái phương pháp nào khác để thể hiện tốt nhất cái giá trị của đất.
So, as rightly pointed out, land normally is not quoted, so you hardly see in level 1. Yeah. At most, you will see level 2 or 3. Okay. Now, so normally we will have valuation report. So in the valuation report, you may have 2 or 1 method. So when we say 2, it's either the income method or a market comparison. So market comparison would be observable. That means they are able to observe these are actual transactions of similar property in the same location and what is the value. That is comparison. They also will put inside their report the income approach, which is based on the estimated cash flow for income and outflow and do a discounted. Yeah, so we normally see for valuation of property, these 2 methods, market comparison and discounted cash flow. So this is very common for residential, commercial, industry property that easily have transaction out there. Unique asset, specialized in nature, we normally only see discounted cash flow.
Vâng, cái phương pháp thu nhập cái phương pháp chiết khấu thu nhập liên quan đến cái DCF ấy thì thông thường với các cái tài sản khác thì chúng ta sẽ tính cái dòng tiền trong khoảng 5 năm. Vậy thì với đất đai thì liệu bởi vì là cái thời gian sử dụng nó có thể là rất lâu dài thì liệu theo bà thì kinh nghiệm quốc tế thì sẽ áp dụng trong vòng bao nhiêu năm thì nó là phù hợp nếu đó là đất sử dụng lâu dài?
So in Malaysia, we have 2 types of land. We have freehold land, which is forever. We have leasehold land. So your model will reflect with the end life. So, but leasehold land, most of the time, now if you embark in IFRS standard, is a lease. Right? For us, we interpret a leasehold land is a lease, a long-term lease. Unless we have reason to believe in substance is a purchase, then we account for it as PPE. Okay. Yeah. So for land, because it lasts forever, you may introduce a terminal value in your discounted cash flow. Okay. That means you're assuming if this cash flow is fixed or with growth, example, if you want to impute a growth to perpetuity. That's what we call terminal value. So this one is an example I have here in my simple model. Okay. So here you can see I put in a terminal value. Okay. Here, how I got this figure is, this is an assumption. I assume that I can bring in this much of cash flow forever. So I embedded an expected growth rate. So this will be subject to challenge. If you think the industry growth rate is 0 or maybe 2%, then you do accordingly. So cash flow divided by the discount rate will give you a terminal value. Means assuming this will last forever. So this value here is assuming if this cash flow is generated forever, the fair value is this amount. So the land, you can use a terminal value for this purpose.
Không, ý tôi nói là ở đây tức là bà cũng lấy từ x1 to x5. Thế nhưng mà bây ở đây chúng ta là cái đất mà sở hữu vĩnh viễn ấy, thì liệu là nếu chỉ tính cái cash flow trong vòng 5 năm này thì liệu nó có đã thể hiện được toàn diện cái fair value của cái mảnh đất chưa?
Okay. So this cash flow, this is a 54. You see, every year cash flow is this amount. For the year is 2 million. For the year is 2 million. This particular example assume that if I actually bring in the same amount forever, based on the best estimate I have as of the 5th year, is 54 million. Yeah. By using a terminal value concept, this is to perpetuity. Yeah. So then if it's forever, it's 67 million. So if you lose a cash flow of 5 years and I don't have this, then I'm saying the asset, for example, I'm valuing has a 5-year life. When you put a terminal value, this is assuming if I put it as to perpetuity, means I'm saying it's unlimited life. Then I get 67 million. So this is one example of model when we value like will also last forever. Unless your company is created to be a limited life entity. So we do have that in Malaysia for limited life entity, has a specific purpose, and at the end of that particular year, they will close and liquidate. Then my cash flow model won't be 5 years. It will be up to that date that the useful life. Yeah, so for this is applicable for potentially land valuation. Yeah. So in Malaysia, we mostly see comparable market data as well, because land, you can see similar land sales. It may not be very frequent, but depends in the area. If there is any land sales, the property valuer will include that in as a market approach. Yeah. Then they also have discounted cash flow, and they will come up with a range that they think is a reasonable range for the fair value of that land.
Các quý vị đại biểu có còn câu hỏi nào nữa không ạ? Tiếp theo chương trình thì chúng tôi xin mời đại diện từ Deloitte Việt Nam sẽ có một vài cái chia sẻ liên quan đến cái chuẩn mực này.